Welcome back. I'm Austin Westfall. We are going to be rounding out the evening here with a couple more hours of coverage. In the meantime, let's send things out to Fox's Alex Hogan with the latest on the Middle East. Let's watch.
After months of fighting, it's quiet at Israel's northern border. The beginning of a 60-day ceasefire has set the stage for the IDF to withdraw from southern Lebanon and for the Lebanese military to move in and patrol the area alongside UN peacekeepers. On Wednesday, thousands of displaced people began making their way home, despite Israeli warnings to avoid the border region where troops are still deployed. Some returned to find nothing left.
Think twice if it's worth coming back. I think that we have lost this strip of land.
President Biden says the U.S. brokered agreement is intended to be permanent, but NATO's leader is urging realistic expectations.
Let's not be naive. Hezbollah is still there. Iran is still backing Hezbollah.
And Israeli officials say they will not hesitate to strike back if Hezbollah violates the deal.
If it tries to rebuild terrorist infrastructure near our border, we will defend ourselves.
The focus now shifts to Gaza, where Hamas indicated Wednesday it is ready for a truce. The White House says it hopes Israel's deal with Hezbollah will force Hamas to the negotiating table.
Hezbollah linked its fight against Israel to the fight that Hamas was having with Israel from Gaza. That link has now been broken, which means Hamas is isolated.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the ceasefire in Lebanon is also an opportunity to focus on Iran and regroup Israeli forces. In Tel Aviv, Israel, Alex Hogan, Fox News.
All right, Alex, thank you for that. We are looking at the White House right now, 10:16 in the nation's capital, 7:16 on the West Coast. Welcome back into Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. Standing by right now, Dr. Alon Burstein. As always, Alon, it's good to see you. I want to get the latest on the war. We do have a live look at Beirut right now. We were watching this camera last night to see if there was any last-minute military activity taking place. We did end up seeing some activity in the final minutes before the ceasefire took place. It's now been just over 24 hours since the ceasefire began, Alone. Are both sides abiding by the terms to keep this thing in place?
It's good to see you, Austin. Broadly, the ceasefire is being maintained. There has been one alert of missile fire or rocket fire towards northern Israel, Arab el-Ramsha. It was then about half an hour later reported that this was a false alarm. So possibly the IDF thought that it saw a rocket fire. Possibly it was a drone. Could have also been a false alarm. Don't know. I will say that historically, it is very, very common for the different terror organizations in the Middle East to fire one or two rockets in the 24 to 48 hour period after a ceasefire takes hold. We even saw this in the hostage deal that was almost exactly a year ago between Israel and Hamas. The truce came into effect at 7 a.m. on that morning. At 7:15, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad fired one rocket. It's sort of a way of these organizations to show we're still here. So I would not be surprised if we do see a rocket being fired sort of here and there. And I'm not belittling it. I'm just saying the way organizations operate. But thus far, it has been maintained. The only event that has sort of taken the headlines has been the fact that the IDF has still announced to Lebanese civilians to not return to southern Lebanon. There's commonly, when these ceasefires are declared, and again, we saw this in Gaza also a year ago, you have sort of the civilians rushing back to the areas they've evacuated from, while the IDF still has military presence there. The IDF told civilians not to return, and then the only incident that was reported in the last 24 hours in Kafr Kila, an area in southern Lebanon, 4 Lebanese were arrested by the IDF, and there's conflicting reports about their identity. The Israeli Prime Minister's office said that they were Hezbollah members and that they've been arrested. The IDF actually put out a statement saying that they don't know if they're Hezbollah members or not, and they are being questioned. But that's the only incident so far that sort of cast a shadow over the ceasefire. Otherwise, at least from what's being reported, except for that incident at Arab el-Ramsha, appears to be maintained.
So I'll ask you a little bit about both the residents in northern Israel and southern Lebanon returning home. I'll get to that in a moment. But I got to ask before that, Netanyahu said Israel would, quote, respond forcefully to any violation by Hezbollah. Does it feel like that's a real possibility here, that either side may either intentionally or intentionally perhaps break the ceasefire?
We're probably going to see both sides try to nominally keep to the ceasefire, at least in the next 2 month period. Obviously, there's lots of unknowns in the war, but each side right now has an interest. Hezbollah has an interest in the Lebanese side being allowed to rebuild itself and the organization being allowed to not only lick its wounds, but actually start rebuilding. One of the ways that Hezbollah became really strong in the last 20 years in southern Lebanon is after the escalations of 2006. Hezbollah was the only force, political and military, operating in southern Lebanon that really rebuilt the area, rebuilt the infrastructure, and also helped the population, gaining a lot of popularity. Hezbollah wants that opportunity again. So we're probably going to see that interest on their side. In Israel, there is a vast interest within the current government to wait for the Trump administration, to wait for Trump to come into the White House. Everyone in Israel, or at least in the government, seemingly is expecting it to be an entirely different ballgame once the Trump administration comes in. So there's also an interest on that side. What is important to look out for, though, are other organizations within southern Lebanon. We have Hamas. Hamas has a presence in southern Lebanon. Palestinian Islamic Jihad has a presence in southern Lebanon. Amal, other organizations have presence in southern Lebanon. They don't have those interests. They don't have the interests of Hezbollah, and they don't have the interests of Israel. They actually have an interest in pushing the envelope, showing, yes, but we're still going to fire. What are you going to do? Will Israel respond with overwhelming force? Israel has said that it will. It probably will not break the bank. It probably will react very, very sort of targeted to a lone rocket fired here or there. Obviously, if there's a mass breach of the ceasefire, we'll see a mass retaliation, but it's unlikely that we'll see that at least in the next 2 months, but we probably will see those smaller incidents.
So I talked about this with Hal yesterday. I want to bounce this off of you, too. This ceasefire basically separates Iran's biggest proxy from the rest of the Axis alone. There's been no ceasefire with Hamas. There's been none with the Houthis, etc. Are the other proxies weaker now that the biggest proxy has been taken out of the fight?
The other proxies have been made weaker throughout the war, and specifically in the last couple of months, because Hezbollah, even though it was stationed in Lebanon, really had its finger in all of the other proxies in the Middle East. Hezbollah has a vast presence within Syria. It has bases there. Hassan Nasrallah was Iran's strongman in the Middle East. Hezbollah had sent operatives to Yemen to help the Houthis build up their arsenal. So the fact that Hezbollah has been hit, and specifically the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah at the end of September, already was a blow to those organizations. In addition to that, we're probably going to see those organizations be weakened because in the deal that was made between Israel and the United States, the side deal in the ceasefire, the United States committed itself to facilitating in Israel stopping the smuggling of weapons from Iran to Lebanon. Now, the United States was doing this anyway, so the only way that I can read that is the United States will start targeting those weapon smugglings in Syria and Iraq probably. Until now, it's shared intelligence with Israel, but I don't know how else to read that commitment other than becoming more active. That said, there is something that's important to state also that distinguishes Hezbollah from those other organizations throughout the Middle East. Hezbollah was the only one of those organizations that operates as a political party. Hezbollah has a military wing, and that's obviously what we focus on for obvious reasons, but it is also a very, very prominent political party. It has a presence in Lebanon's cabinet, in the parliament. It has its own banking system. It has an entire apparatus within Lebanon that it needs to worry about. Other militias in Iraq, the Islamic brigades of Iraq, Hezbollah in Iraq, Hamas, to some extent even the Houthis, don't have the same considerations when they are running this war. So they don't have the same interest of preserving their assets, facilitating the population, showing that they are helping the population rather than just carrying on the fight. So with that, Hezbollah by far was the strongest militia, probably still is even, in the Middle East. However, alongside that, they also have this other set of considerations that these other militias are sort of free from incorporating into their strategy or tactics. So with that, that helps us also understand why Hezbollah has other interests in maintaining a ceasefire. Other militias probably not.
And this is some of the most quiet, if you will, images, and we're not seeing any activity on these cameras. It was regular, we would check in with these cameras around this time of night, every night, and it would be fairly common for us to see military activity over the skies of Beirut. This is the Beirut metro. You and I have talked constantly over the months as the fight up north became more and more turbulent. In recent months especially, though, Israel started nailing Hezbollah relentlessly. They took out a number of high-profile leaders, destroyed a large amount of terrorist groups, took out a large amount of the group's infrastructure, I should say. Alon, what do we know about how long it took for Hezbollah to build up everything that's been eliminated in recent months, not only in southern Lebanon, but also in Beirut? How far did Israel set them back before the ceasefire was called?
So the organization has been set back a lot. A lot of its infrastructure in southern Lebanon has been completely destroyed. A lot of what it had built up in the Dahia region in Beirut, which is the southern areas of Beirut, have been completely destroyed. Pictures are emerging from the Dahia region showing the levels of devastation that that region has seen in at least the last 2 months, if not in the entire war. Hezbollah has been building itself up really in Lebanon for well over 30 years, but in earnest in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years. Hezbollah went through several different phases. In the year 2000, Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon and had maintained a presence in southern Lebanon for 18 years. It withdrew, and that was really the greatest victory for Hezbollah. That was one of its biggest moments. It was sailing on the roads of, we're the only ones that managed to force the IDF to give up territory anywhere in the Middle East. Then Hezbollah started to really invest in rebuilding and reestablishing its army. Then it saw some setbacks as a result of the assassination of the former Lebanese prime minister that was attributed to Hezbollah. Hezbollah also was very strong in Lebanon, so it was very unclear how exactly the movement was going to be held accountable or not held accountable, but this really set it back. It was also really set back because of its involvement in the Syrian civil war. Iran ordered Hezbollah to send troops to help Syria. This really angered a lot of Lebanese population. Hezbollah was seen as the protector of Lebanon from Israel. What the hell are we doing sending our boys, so to speak, to die for the Assad regime in Syria? So all those things set Hezbollah back, but really in the last 10 years, I would say, since Assad sort of established himself in Syria, Hezbollah has been able to pour all of its energy into rebuilding its arsenal, rebuilding its image, and rebuilding its also the economy, the economic apparatus that it has within Lebanon, really in the last, I would say, 10 years, maybe even 15 years. Now, has the group been set back 10 to 15 years now? Probably not. On the one hand, the group, you don't lose all the knowledge and infrastructure and economic power that you have built as a result of this escalation, on the one hand. On the other hand, what it probably has lost is a lot of the support of the Lebanese population. The Lebanese population is very, very likely, at least some segments of it, very, very likely are going to be looking at the situation and saying, this was supposed to be you protecting us against Israel, which is understandable from the Lebanese perspective, again, given Israel's long occupation of southern Lebanon. You were supposed to protect us. What happened here? You dragged Lebanon into the war that was you declared, Hassan Nasrallah declared in November last year, 100% Palestinian. You dragged us into the war. Lebanon is decimated. Most of Hezbollah, at least the leaders, have been killed. And for what? At the end, you didn't compel Israel to come to a ceasefire in Gaza. That is going to be where Hezbollah now is going to have to really pour its efforts to try to justify what has happened to the Lebanese population, which of course takes us to internal Lebanese politics, and how that's going to be remains to be seen. A lot depends on the ceasefire.
All right, speaking of the Lebanese population, the UN says that the Israel-Hezbollah fight has driven more than 1.2 million Lebanese people from their homes. That's about a fifth of the country's population, according to the UN. Israel estimates about 60,000 people evacuated northern Israeli communities to flee Hezbollah's rockets. What's next for people, and you already alluded to this earlier, but what is next for people on both sides of the border? Are these areas damaged? Will it take time for life to get back to some semblance of normalcy in these communities?
So we should probably distinguish between two things. One is the population in northern Israel and in southern Lebanon that have been evacuated already for over a year since the war began. That is that number that you said, about 60 to 70,000 in Israel. In southern Lebanon, that number was about 80,000 to 100,000 Lebanese. From southern Lebanon, another 60 to 70,000 from northern Israel. Then, with the IDF invasion of southern Lebanon and the massive escalation of the last couple of months, we have seen massive internal displacement in Lebanon as civilians were fleeing from areas that were not part of the quote-unquote southern Lebanon. Sor, Sidon, Beirut, etc., etc. those people, those civilians, that's, again, let's say 800,000, 900,000, if we're going to take those UN numbers, those people are probably going to be able to return to the areas that they fled from relatively quickly because the IDF doesn't have presence there. They were ordered by the IDF to evacuate the areas as a result of attacks that were coming. And a lot of them also chose to flee because the IDF was carrying a lot of attacks there. They're probably going to be able to return within the next coming weeks. They're going to find a lot of destruction. Again, in the areas of the Dahia in Beirut, we've seen large parts of the neighborhood entirely decimated. But they're going to be able to return, and we're probably going to see a lot of investment, both of Hezbollah and of the Lebanese government, in rebuilding. That is different than southern Lebanon and northern Israel. The IDF is going to maintain its presence in southern Lebanon according to the agreement for 60 days. That's still another 2 months. Remains to be seen if maybe the IDF will withdraw faster if the Lebanese army deploys a little faster. But either way, I do not expect to see Lebanese civilians that have been evacuated, those 80 to 100,000 evacuated from southern Lebanon already for a year. I don't expect to see them coming back in the next 2 months until the IDF at least completely withdraws. Similarly, it is very unlikely that we're going to see the population return to northern Israel until there's some sort of recognition that the ceasefire not only is holding, but that Hezbollah is not rearming itself. We have to remember, from the Israeli psyche, the situation on October 6th last year, before the war breaks out, you had population living in the north, population living in the area surrounding Gaza. Everyone felt safe and secure. October 7th comes in, decimates that feeling. No one feels secure anymore. It's going to be very, very hard to convince the Israeli population to return to live in northern Israel if they're seeing that Hezbollah is violating the deal, maybe even if it's not firing missiles, but is rebuilding itself in southern Lebanon. So that's a distinction I would make. Within Lebanon itself, probably going to see a mass return of population. Southern Lebanon, probably still, at least I would say 2 months. Northern Israel, it's going to be a process of convincing the population that the IDF can keep them safe and that they're not going to get on October 7th in the north.
Alon uploads his own YouTube videos to his personal YouTube account. He gives regular updates on the Middle East. Alon, good to see you. Have a good night.